Welcome everyone to the opening event of Sharp in Focus. We're very sad not to be in Amsterdam, but it's lovely to have the opportunity to all be here virtually today. I am Melanie Ramdersham-Bold, Sharp's Director of Awards, and I'm so delighted to be here today to chair this Decolonizing Book History Roundtable with this most excellent group of scholars. So Priya Joshi, hi Priya, is she's a book historian who spent a good decade digging in colonial archives in London and India. A portion of what she found there was published in her first book, In Another Country, Colonialism, Culture and the English Novel in India, published by Columbia University Press in 2002, and winner of the MLA First Book Prize, amongst others. It appeared in Bollywood's India, a public fantasy, Columbia Press, 2015, with more to come in the social work of the novel, which is in process. Very excited about that. We've got Professor Marina Garona Gravier. Hello.
Hola, ¿qué tal?
Hola. A tenured researcher at the Bibliographic Research Institute of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where she heads the interdisciplinary seminar in bibliology. In 2017, she co-founded and is currently coordinator of the Latin American Network for Graphic Culture. She's a specialist in book and publishing history in Mexico and Latin America, with an emphasis on printed culture in indigenous languages and book materiality. We also have Jane Lee Cole. Hi, Jane.
Hello.
A professor of English at Loyola University, Maryland. Sorry, I've never been able to pronounce that. And editor of the journal American Periodicals. Her research focuses on American literature and visual culture from the Civil War to 1920. And her most recent book, How the Other Half Laughs, The Comic Sensibility in American Culture, 1895 to 1920, was published earlier this year and sounds fantastic. We also have Kenoi Nishikawa, an assistant professor of English and African American Studies at Princeton University, where he specializes in modern African American book history. His first book, Street Players, Black Pulp Fiction and the Making of a Literary Underground, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2018. He's currentrently working on a project about African American literature and book design. Hi, Kenoi. We also have Andrea Reyes Elizondo, a self-published PhD candidate on reading history at the University of Leiden, where she also works as a part-time researcher and co-chairs the Dutch Book Historical Society with book conservator Harry, am I pronouncing that wrong?
Herre de Vries.
Yeah. Her PhD focuses on the possibilities of reading in 18th century New Spain. And finally, our latest addition to the roundtable is Derrick R Spyers, an associate professor of English and affiliate faculty in American Studies, Visual Studies, and Media Studies. He specializes in early African American and American print culture. His first book, The Practice of Citizenship, Black Politics and Print Culture in the Early United States, published by Pennsylvania Press 2019, won the 2020 Bibliographical Society Prize and the 2019 MLA Book Prize. Whew, okay, so before we start, I just want to give you a bit of context about the roundtable. It was something that my lovely co-organizer, Professor Daniela Fuller, and I tried to pull together for one of the Sharp conferences a couple of years ago. We put a call out for participants on Sharpell, and while we were inundated with great proposals from brilliant scholars, we decided not to go ahead with it because it didn't meet our requirement that 50% of the participants should be Black, Indigenous, and/or people of colour. Danielle and I tried to revisit the roundtable for Sharp Amsterdam. We circulated the call on Sharpell again, and this time we exceeded our requirements. Today, we're proud to present a pared down version of what we intended for Amsterdam. We acknowledge that there are some voices missing from the discussion today. However, we intend for this Decolonizing Book History Roundtable to be a regular, perhaps annual event, and we welcome suggestions on how it can be developed. It would be so wonderful to connect with more scholars working in this area. So the main aim of this roundtable is to make a space for scholars and activists to take the pulse of book history's decolonial and decentering possibilities and limits, and to talk practically about methods for creating change. Today, the discussions will take place in English and Spanish, and we're so grateful to Marina for her translation and to Andrea's help with translations during the session as well. Thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
And this is definitely something that we'd like to do more of at future events. So please turn on closed captioning for direct translations of Spanish into English. There should be a wee notification to do this at the bottom of your screen. And just some housekeeping before we begin. There are hundreds of us at this virtual event today, which is super heartening because we all know that this is a really important topic to discuss and address. But it also means that we'll probably have to keep interaction to a minimum. If you do have any questions or comments, please type them into the chat and we'll try and answer or address them at the very end. And I'm sure we've all been in enough Zoom meetings over the last 2 months to last us a lifetime, but I still need to remind you to keep yourself muted and to keep your video off if you're not one of the speakers or if you're not speaking. Okay, finally. So we're going to begin this discussion with a question that all of us, so roundtable participants and audience members, may want to answer. If, as an audience member, you want to answer this first question, then please type your comment into the chat. So, roundtable participants, in a couple of sentences, can you tell us what decolonizing book history means in your own practice?
Can I start? Yeah. Okay, so for me, I'm a PhD student, and for me, so I'm still doing my research on book history, and for me, decolonizing book history means situating book and reading history inside the wider cultural and social environment of the period that I am studying. And this includes seeing and naming who is missing from traditional historiography, and making sure that we're not brushing out differences in accesses to just for the sake of making it more inclusive. Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. Does anyone else have anything to speak to or add to that?
Sí, ¿puedo? ¿Puedo hablar?
Sí.
Ok. Bueno, primero, muchas gracias por el espacio para expresar algunas de las ideas en este tema. Desde el punto de vista conceptual, así como también desde el pragmatismo académico, yo asocio la idea del colonialismo con la de imperialismo, ya que el colonialismo es un tipo particular de estrategia imperialista históricamente situada. Pensar en términos de imperialismo en la historia del libro hace más claro un conjunto de acciones de dominación, discriminación y subordinación que han sucedido antes y todavía ocurren ahora. Creo también que en América Latina el colonialismo se mezcla de forma casi indisoluble con otras manifestaciones de dominación, discriminación y sometimiento. Me refiero concretamente a machismo, racismo y xenofobia. De manera concreta, en mis investigaciones, me he interesado en sujetos históricos que hasta hace al menos 15 o 20 años no habían sido tratados o habían sido tratados de manera escasa en la historia regional del libro. Concretamente me refiero a mujeres impresoras y a indios calígrafos e impresores durante el periodo colonial.
Did you see the subtitles, or should we quickly translate?
I can't see the subtitles. So what I'm doing is I'm just putting it into the chat just now. But while I do that, you know, Priya, I think you wanted to jump in next.
Sure, thanks. For those of you, the subtitles have just gone in thanks to Andrea's translation and Mel's, so you'll see them on the side. And this is a nice way to follow up. I mean, decolonizing book history has, for me, a kind of double act, and it's a double act of critique and counter discourse, right? And I think it's something that Marina has just said in Spanish. Critique involves reading different or reading very familiar objects differently. So I would read the novel, but I wouldn't read it the way it's been read by Anglophone or by British scholars. I might read it from a post-colonial perspective. So critique involves reading a familiar object differently. But the other part of decolonizing book history is the practice of counter discourse, which is choosing different objects of study. So again, it's choosing perhaps writings or readings of the subaltern. In my case, I'm interested in the history of readers rather than the history of publishing. So critique and counter discourse are fundamental to what book history and decolonizing this practice can do. And for me, again, this project of critique and counter discourse begins in two different kinds of archives. Those archives that exist, and my screen in the back, my backdrop is the British Library, and I'll hopefully talk about that, talk about a monument of empire, but it's also the monument by which empire was undone, and we can get to that. So critique and counter discourse then happen in two kinds of archives, those that exist, the mortar and brick archive behind me, and those that we fabricate in our own practice as book historians.
Just to keep this conversation going, colonialism and enslavement are epistemological projects. They're as much about ways of knowing and thinking as they are modes of domination and subjugation. And so those ways of knowing and thinking survive in the institutions, again, following up on Priya's point, that grant our work symbolic value and that materially support our livelihoods and research. My approach to book history is mindful of the disparities that condition our work, and I try to move against them in two ways. First, by looking beyond official archives for stories that disrupt the knowledge production of diversity and inclusion. And second, and this is something Priya Joshi's In Another Country does particularly well, I think, by tracing the itineraries between center and periphery that led me to certain research findings. And I can't sort of emphasize the importance of that component of what I do enough, because in the very writing up of my research, I'm trying to articulate what I did in order to find what I found, and in order to conclude what I did about the objects that I combine in order to produce new knowledge of subaltern histories. So it's the movement beyond official archives and then between center and periphery that I'm interested in. Thank you.
I'll jump in here. I think a lot about ethics and method. So when I think decolonizing my own work, I think about centering the priorities, the methods, the theoretical frameworks of the enslaved, oppressed people, right? So I'm not looking for ways that early African Americans did book history, did the book in the way that book history has traditionally framed the book and trying to fit them in. I'm trying to figure out how they understood this technology, how they used it, towards what ends, what keywords, what frameworks, what institutional structures they found enlivening, and centering that and working from that premise, so that I'm not reading this archive as always reacting to some sort of power base, but as always generating its own values, its own circuits, its own impulses. And also being mindful that some of what I observe is a reproduction of the structures that I'm trying to work against. And as Kenoi said, both within the archive and within the works that I'm working with, but also within my own modes and ways of understanding. So always going back and forth with recentering, decentering, critiquing, revising, in motion.
And I guess I'm last, but hopefully not least. I'm really wanting to speak today to editorial practice and how this both participates and sometimes prevents change from happening. You know, I think when we think of editors, we mostly think in terms of the metaphor of gatekeeping. And there's been some discussion on Medium from the Race Before Race group about this idea of gatekeeping and how we need to rethink editorial practice to not just be gatekeeping, but something more capacious, you know, something more invitational. And as an editor of a journal, I realized that the way editorial practice happens in most cases, even though I was actually trying to include other voices, there were certain structures in place, even at the journal I was at, that was preventing those voices from actually making it through peer review and making it into print. And so that has really made me rethink, think of other metaphors that we could use in editorial practice. As opposed to gatekeeping, shutting things out. And so I've really been thinking as an editor of seeing myself as a convener, as a host, especially as a mentor. I've really been trying to think about editorial mentorship as a model and as a guide, both for authors and also for peer review, which I think is really critical.
And we'll go back to some of those more practical, pragmatic steps at the end of this conversation. But I just want to go back to some of your points. I mean, both Marina and Derrick, you used the word domination, and Marina, you said that colonization is a particular type of imperialist strategy with a set of actions of domination, discrimination, and subordination. And obviously, our focus is on a sort of dialectical reversal of this. And Walter Benjamin said, quote, "There's no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism," unquote. So the question is, to what extent is this true in your own practices, and how would you respond to this quote? Priya, if you want to maybe start and jump in there.
Okay, thanks, Mel. So this will pick up a number of themes that are coming through on the chat feature. But Benjamin made these remarks he made the remarks in 1940, shortly before he died of suicide, and then they were published over a decade later after World War II. But they're a chance for me, and I think for us, to contemplate the language and practice of conquest and power, right? The exact quote, Mel, which you read, and I'll just reread it because I was a little distracted. "There's no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." Okay, so Benjamin's point was that victors write history and establish monuments to their victory. We see this, and we see this in the monuments of disgrace that are being toppled around us in multiple cities. But for me, the quote is useful because Benjamin is allowing us to see that quote unquote victory and rule are themselves embedded in a deep history of what he calls barbarism. So he is very ironic about what he means by civilization. So that's one. And so this dialectical process by which the nature of civilization is embedded in barbarism, right? This dialectical process is an opportunity that I think book history has for the last 20 plus years seized on. And here I want to make a giant shout out to the journal Book History. Jonathan Rose was the founding editor. He gave me my start. My first published article came out there. And the kind of mentorship and openness to doing work that Catherine Harris and others are commenting in chat, it's really hard to find out about print culture studies in the periphery or the global South. Book History was very hospitable to me, and I've felt that it's now my job, my obligation, my duty to pay that back. So Jean, thank you for saying what you said about mentoring. All right, so there's this dialectical process. So how does this work pragmatically? So the archives that book history uses, right? And here Zach Lesser's backdrop is kind of cool. It's this kind of old print cultural workshop, but this kind of archive that book history is using both maintains certain ideologies of power, but I'm going to propose that they also expose the history of barbarism. So the backdrop of my screen, which is the Great Court of the British Museum, had on desk, somebody's going to correct me, was it S15 or T12? I can't remember. Mark sat and undid the entire history of sort of quote unquote Western civ and Western capitalism, sitting in that very monument of so-called civilization. So this is the kind of work that archives enable because they're repositories of both that civilization and barbarism. So how does this relate to book history? Well, I think our methods are very interdisciplinary methods. can open or close these archives to new interpretation, right? Critique and counter discourse, the stuff I began with. So I see these archives then as contact zones with the past and with the barbarism that we might undo. So again, it's not what one reads, but how. And I think book history's methods, and I'm very fond of them, are exactly a training of choosing what we read and choosing how we read it. So critique is reading differently, counter discourse is reading different things that we can pull out from the archives.
Please do jump in if you have anything to say, anyone.
So a very basic point to follow up on that. And this gets back to my second move in my own book historical practice of always tracing the itineraries in my consulting of archives and extra institutional collections to create new narratives. There's no value neutral archive. And from my perspective, one of the missteps in the archival turn in the humanities and interpretive social sciences has been to abstract the definition of the archive beyond its meaning as an institutional repository. So, you know, it no longer suffices to refer to personal effects as a collection, files, your overflowing inbox, or even a hoard, right? Everything is an archive, such that any act of saving becomes an act of archiving. While I think this does create some possibilities for interpretation, I think we also, so this is a both and, need to return to thinking about the inequities that undergird the archive as a product of institutional knowledge production. So for me, the document of which Benjamin speaks is housed in an archive. And that dialectic of civilization and calamity is contained not necessarily in that document, so much as in how that document arrives down to us, which is why it's very important for me when dealing with institutional archives to describe as much as possible the routes that took me there and why it's important to recognize the institutional politics of that repository. Just being a little bit more reflexive about how we receive these documents of history would do a great deal. And there's a lot of great work being done in exactly this vein, but it's just a helpful reminder on my part. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could pick up on that. I've been thinking a lot about not just, you know, I mean, I think when we're talking, or when Kenoi was talking about institutions, he's talking about big I institutions. And when Priya was talking about civilizations, that's like big C civilization. But, you know, I think I'm interested in the kinds of archives that happen in things that are not recognized as civilizations. Things that communities that big C civilization might see as barbaric. They don't see themselves as barbaric at all. And so I'm also thinking about how we can think beyond just the whole construct of civilization and barbarism, which is about colonialism, and really think about alternate forms of meaning and multiple kinds of civilizations and epistemologies. That, you know, we can maybe shift the whole frame altogether.
And Priya, you were shaking your head there.
You know, I want to just give a shout out to my sister Preeti Joshi, who's one of the is in the audience, and maybe Preeti you can comment. But Preeti and her colleague Susan Ziegler have been doing some pretty amazing work on ephemera, and I think it leads to Jean's point. I don't think I or Benjamin big C civilization, right? It's exactly the documents that nobody's had to look at, pornography or sleaze. This is Kenoi's book, Street Players, or Seven
or
Almonds.
comic strips.
or comic strips, right? Your book on graphic narratives, or Preeti's work on ephemera, Preeti and Susan's work on ephemera, on Post-it stamps, right? These also are part of stories. This is a material history that are part of stories. And in our conversation is also Matt Kirschenbaum, whose amazing work on digital archives is really helpfupful. Like, how do we think about a text not as what we have in front of us, but all the pre-texts, right, that are possibly only embedded in John Updike's computer files that Matt spent years at Houghton Library sort of uncovering. So I don't mean it as a big C. I think it's important that there are small C's, and that book history gives researchers and students tools to think about those other C's that are not necessarily changed. Here, I'd love to hear if librarians feel that our archives are, that your archiving practice has changed because of the populist turn of reading.
Could I jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say, Andrea, Derrick, do you have anything to add to that? On you go, Andrea.
Yes. So I was thinking about this quote when we were discussing it before, and so for me, when I read also more the text, which I think Priya put the link on the chat. So for me, it resonates what Benjamin was saying about, at some point he says that historians look at the text or these documents with horror because we know the origin of these documents and these archives, so we know where they come from. My research is 18th century New Spain, so there's plenty of horror, not more or less than others, but there's plenty of there. And so I do agree that our task as scholars is to look at for documents that have not been included in these archives, but this also touches upon inequality of access, because this is challenging for some regions. And then you can also say, I mean, there's so many archives that have not been, or it's more some sort of collection, but it hasn't been really described in Latin America, and even just getting access to it, and the scholar getting funding for that, like, hey, give me a year to look into this church archive that maybe I won't find anything. So those are the challenges. So I think also we need to work also with the existing collections, and how Priya said, is to also use their silences against them. So what they're not mentioning, and also Kenoi was mentioning this, so really dig into what is this archive and what is it not telling. And of course, looking at other collections is great if you have access to that, but sometimes we don't have access to those collections.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something that I've been thinking about as we've been talking, and that's the tension between what's there and what's not, and how the metadata disappears things. So as a graduate student, I visited a really big institutional archive and did the archive tour, and told the person giving the tour I was interested in African-American newspapers from early America. And she looked at me and said, "Oh, they had those back there? We just passed a newspaper on the shelf." And so there's a kind of, and it was there, it was cataloged and everything, but the way things were cataloged made it even more difficult to see what the object actually was and what it did. And so figuring out, going back to this notion of following the trails that we take to get to where we find our objects, find our people in one way or another, becomes really important, because that sort of exposes the ongoing generation of the civilized barbarism binary. I always feel a little bit uncomfortable reading that, because I'm sort of both not wanting to be included in the we and the historian, but also seeing myself in it. It's a psychic dissonance that I don't think should go away, that should be maintained. But also, like, it's a tension that even the archives I work on, not the archives as in the people working against these institutions, face too. And so I'm constantly going in the archives, dealing with this dissonance, and dealing with people who are writing into this dissonance too. And they become sort of my interlocutors of figuring out how to process, how to deal with it. How do you deal with it when you're submitting documents to a state government and they spend the entire session debating whether or not your document is an appeal, a memorial, a petition, because those cataloging sort of moves have deep political power. And they're using the political metadata to decide whether or not they should even pay attention to this document.
Does anyone else have anything more to add to that? So I thought you've all talked in some respects about the kind of responsibilities that we have as scholars and as researchers, not only in decolonizing and decentering our disciplines, but also in the methods that we use to research as well. And it's certainly something that I've been thinking about in my own practices, and also when I've been designing my modules for the next academic year as well. And I'm rereading Sarah Ahmed at the moment. So there's obviously a low number of people of colour studying and researching book history, and cultural bias and a sort of lack of plurality of voices may account for this. And with everything that we've been discussing today, and with that in mind, what does it mean to you to decolonize a curriculum or decenter a curriculum, and how does this interact with other legacies of decentering dominant forms of knowledge? Derrick or Marina, do you want to jump in and start with that one?
Creo que en mi caso, bueno, en mi experiencia, para responder eso, hay que primero estar muy conscientes de nuestras ideas sobre aquello que merece ser estudiado o recordado, y sobre las formas en que escogemos los contenidos académicos que enseñamos a los estudiantes. Algunos de los elementos que, en mi opinión, permiten descolonizar el currículum son la elección de los contenidos, las formas de comprender el tiempo histórico y la manera en que visualizamos los espacios y las geografías en nuestro trabajo. En mi opinión, 3 acciones para descentralizar el currículum serían las siguientes. 1, ampliar las ideas de la diacronía habitual de las historias del libro para incorporar manifestaciones diversas de otras tradiciones escritas, no centrales. Pienso en el caso de los códices prehispánicos u otras manifestaciones de escritura que a veces se ven de manera más bien folclórica en las narrativas generales de la historia del libro. Cuestionar también las ideas preconcebidas sobre cuál es la cronología natural para la aparición o adopción de alguna tecnología gráfica específica. Me refiero a imprenta tipográfica, litografía, linotipo o la incorporación de la computadora. Ya que cada cultura tiene un tempo propio que no debe ser comparado con las de las tradiciones centrales. Y en último lugar, me atrevería a decir también que hay que enseñar otros modos de mirar y describir la materialidad de los objetos bibliográficos. Pienso concretamente los de América Latina para ir más allá de los parámetros habituales de las culturas dominantes. Salir del lindo, feo, el atrasado o al día respecto de la cultura. Eso sería.
Last bit that Marina mentioned, it was not on the, I put the translation in the chat, but what she says is that we should be, leave these dichotomies on pretty, ugly, or advanced, primitive.
Mm.
Oh, you're muted.
Do you want to add anything about your own experiences and practices to that?
Okay, yeah, so I follow the, I subscribe to the idea of what Marina was saying, that it's also part of what we have as canon in book history. Mm-hmm. And because usually these are groundbreaking works, which are not bad, but they only focus on specific regions. And once they're in these regions, it's only usually on certain segments of the population. But another aspect of these is that these works, they are often coupled to these narratives of splendor that they're very close with to civilization with a big C. So an example is the Atlas Mayor of John Blau, that was printed in here in Amsterdam. It's a beautiful multi-volume work. Any library that has it will show it. It's beautiful, has hundreds of finely engraved maps. But how did this work came to be? So I think this is also something that we should also consider in book history. So how the actual production of this book happened? It just didn't happen. I mean, when we look at this dichotomy of advanced and primitive, if we would consider this advanced, how did this come to happen? And why it didn't happen somewhere else? So I think decolonizing our curriculum requires that we contextualize this pair that we see as splendor, civilization, and beautiful typographic works, because they happen on a colonial context that was based on exploitation. So I think, I'm not saying that we should burn them or get rid of them, but we just also need to say how this came to be. That's my grain.
Está bueno.
Derrick, do you want to jump in and add something?
Yes, please, and thank you. I agree with everything that's been said here, and I put in the chat Dorothy Porter's work, because she essentially saw that the cataloging system was not working to visualize Black writing, Black work, Black literature. And so she retooled the card catalog to map what the community she served needed. And I tether that to my rereading of James Cone's A Black Theology of Liberation. And one of his key arguments about theology is the theology of today serves the needs of the community today. And I think that's been percolating in the chat. So the methodologies that we employ in our work, the institutional structures we employ in our work, when we do that, we need to ask the question, what communities are we trying to serve, right? And why? What communities have we traditionally served, willingly or not? And why? And how can we get from point A to point B? What are the moves that we need to make? Another question we need to ask is who's in the room and how did they get there? So for instance, I really appreciate organizers' conscious move to make sure that this panel was at least 50% or more people of color, right? And then the next step might be, how did we get here? I know Kenoi and I participated in the Mellon program. I was a UNCF Mellon Fellow. At last I checked, maybe a majority of the Black PhDs in the United States went through the UNCF Mellon program through HBCUs. So if there are institutional structures that are changing the dynamics of who's in the room, how do we strengthen those institutional structures? Another thing about HBCUs is they're often horribly underfunded and a distance away, either physically and or institutionally, from the archives that traditionally house book history work, right? So how do we engage these students, this sort of already existing pipeline of folks, into a field that seems very distant from, for instance, my undergrad, Tulu College? And really, we were doing, which is not to say that we weren't doing something that was book history. It's just that there was a kind of institutional, structural distance between what we were doing and the language, the methods, the sort of folk of book history. So those are the things I think about. And again, Porter is a great model because she's taking sort of the tools at hand. She's working with what she's got. Sometimes in very visible ways, and sometimes she was very savvy, let's put it that way, tactically inventive in how to use what she had at hand. Right? So.
If I could just jump on that, we've been talking about who's in the room and how did we get here, but there are also lots of other rooms, right? And being conscious of how this work is being done outside the room. I think, Derrick, you were getting at that a little bit, but I think that's really important too. I mean, this is my first Sharp conference. I was actually trained by a book historian, and I think I do this work, but I haven't really, Sharp has not been central to my my scholarship, and so I think just being recognizing that Sharp is not the only room also is important, because I think there's a ton of African-American book history that's being done outside of Sharp. Also, you know, I mean, in all kinds of ways. And so I think that's important too, in terms of thinking about curriculum, is thinking about assigning texts that are not just within the, you know, the anthologies of book history that, that often get assigned, or thinking about, I know Priya, you know, book history has been a wonderful resource for you, but, you know, like thinking outside of just the publications that focus on book history also, and looking for the work there.
So Mel, if I could just jump in, Jean, thank you for saying what you did. And there are many other rooms is exactly right. But I will say, and this is a conversation that's happening quite actively this past week on Twitter, and Andrea and I think Mel have put it up on the beginning of our chat, which is a group of medieval scholars who've said, look, we have this cool work we're doing on race. Could PMLA consider having a conversation about it? And PMLA, which is the kind of flagship journal of modern language studies, said, nah, sorry, you're too narrow. You're not very well focused. So this brought up the whole kind of gatekeeping conversation. I want to say that in part, at least 20 years ago, when I published in 1995, my first essay in book history, Sharp was the one place that had an open door, or that had a bigger tent, right? I could not get myself even conceived of or talked of doing book history with Asian studies or with South Asian journals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's what it is. Newer fields are open, you get in on the ground up, et cetera, et cetera. It's possible that we need more work, but there is another kind of gatekeeping that I think we might want to talk about, which is gender. We've talked a lot about race, but I would really be curious to have a conversation about gender and why so many, visually anyway, looking at the names and the faces when they cropped up in this conversation tend to be more women. But if you look at citational practices or public, or, you know, the number of people who get in on certain journals, there's a certain kind of still a disequity. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about gender as well in this conversation. It may not be perhaps in this panel, but that's something to think about.
Very happy for us to extend the conversation again. If anyone wants to jump in.
Quería agregar una cosa a propósito de un comentario que hizo Devin Fitzgerald en el chat, y me vino a la mente otra posibilidad de otra idea pragmática de cómo incorporar la descentralización en el currículum, que es
this is an idea that Marina just got from a comment that Devin Fitzgerald made on decentering. So this is a practical step.
Creo que también necesitamos reforzar estudios comparados entre espacios geográficos no convencionales o no habituales. Pienso concretamente las relaciones entre Nueva España y el lejano Oriente, que tuvieron una fuerte conexión durante el periodo colonial. Pensar esos espacios de vinculación no convencionales, no desde el centro o la metrópoli dominante y sus colonias, sino inclusive entre colonias. Lo mismo ocurriría entre los virreinatos de la Nueva España y el Perú. Creo que eso también podría ayudar a descentrar.
So a practical step, or a suggestion would be to make comparative studies that are usually not done because they're of the geographical locations. So it would be, for example, the colonies in Latin America between them, but also with the Far East kingdoms and colonies as well. And then not looking necessarily at the colonies of the same empire from Europe, but then comparing amongst them also how was book and reading history happening in these places.
Gracias.
Nada. And actually, just to jump in, my original idea for my PhD thesis, but that was too much. I wanted to compare how were the reading possibilities between New Spain and Indonesia, which is a very different colony. But of course, that's too big for a PhD. So once I finish this, that will be my next step too. To look at Indonesia, which was an unusual colony because it was from the Netherlands, but it was not the same way done as in Spain. Sorry for jumping in and self-promotion.
Please always jump in and promote anything that you have, please. Does anyone want to jump in and say anything else to that question?
Well, sobre el mismo punto que decía antes, creo que los estudios comparados entre culturas con sistemas de escritura diferentes pueden ser también muy nutritivos, pueden hacernos pensar cosas muy originales. Y también el diálogo con disciplinas próximas, pero que tienen otra estructura epistemológica. En mi trabajo ha sido fundamental trabajar con lingüistas para todo lo que es edición en lenguas indígenas. Entonces, creo que eso abre mucho los diálogos y no que deja la historia del libro solo para historiadores del libro, sino que la hace significativa para otras áreas.
So it can be very enriching if these comparisons are not done only between regions that have the same writing systems, but also different writing systems, and also to step a little bit out of our book history approaches or focuses, and then also work with other disciplines that have different methodologies and epistemologies, and that can also be very enriching. For Marina's work, this has been particularly the case when she has been working with linguists for her work on indigenous books and calligraphy.
Oh, perfect. So you've all given some really practical advice there. And I think that's actually what we need moving forwards. So to end with, I want to ask a kind of, moving forward question. So firstly, what are the obstacles, real or imagined, that keep book history so provincial? And what are some of the pragmatic steps to open the gates to more capacious forms of book history scholarship? And please jump in if you no need to be polite, just jump in if you have something to say.
Well, I have a lot to say about this. I think because so much of what I do is about the practical and how, like, what are the obstacles that are preventing this awesome work from getting into print? I thought just by becoming an editor, this would all happen, and it hasn't. And so that's, so I've really been thinking a lot about this. If I could just talk about representation. You know, I think we don't really talk about this enough because it raises the specter of identity politics. But to me, that is a huge and very real obstacle. And just to put this in some context, there have been some statistics that have come out recently. And the fact that these statistics are not widely known, and a lot of people don't want to share them, I think is really important. But in the US, in 2017, for those of you who are not here, you may not know that the US is actually reaching the minority-majority tipping point, meaning that more than 50% of the US population is non-white, almost. Right now, where in 2017, 51% of the US population was white, 14% Black, 25% Hispanic, 5% Asian, and the rest made up of either 2 or more races or Native American, and so on. But given that only 10% of university faculty in the US are Black or Hispanic, and this is despite the fact that in the US since the 1960s, there have been, if not before, there have been efforts to try to diversify academia. So something is not working there when the representation is so disproportionate to the general population. And then once you get higher up, so thinking about who is considered a senior scholar, the disparities become even more pronounced. So if you look at the university student population, that 15% of that population now in the United States is Black. Only 6% of university faculty in the United States are at the full professor rank. And that's a problem. In the outside the US, I think things are worse in many places. The UK becomes a kind of whipping boy for this. But just some statistics here, only 140 out of 21,000, or less than 0.7% of faculty of professors in the UK are Black. Only 6% are Asian, 85% are white. And then other countries, we don't even have statistics because they don't actually tabulate them. And for example, I just gave a talk in Germany. There might be some people who were at this Transnational Periodical Cultures conference that I was at in January. But I was told when I was there that in Germany, no statistics are actually kept about who the Black faculty are. And I think this lack of record keeping is a way, you know, I think in the chat there have been some commentary about how this happens in cataloging. But when you don't have the statistics, then the problem remains invisible. And when it's invisible, you can ignore it. So I just wanted to bring up the statistics as a way of just saying this is a problem and an obstacle that, that needs to be addressed. So, you know, some of the ways that the pragmatic steps that we might, oh, and there was one other thing that I also wanted to say, is that when you think about the disparity of representation in academia, but at the same time you think about how many people are actually doing work on histories of marginalized populations. Think about who's doing that work. And by and large, the work is now being done by white scholars. And it has really been troubling to me to see a kind of recolonization of academia in the actual objects of study that were intended to actually diversify the academy in the first place. So I'll just mention a couple things that, and actually bring together some of the things that have already been suggested in this forum that can be done to try to breach this obstacle. One is example, this panel is an example of actually saying, yes, we actually are intentionally including people of color, scholars of color, onto panels, onto plenaries, as here, which I'm very honored to be on this plenary. Organizational boards and organizations themselves, prize panels, thinking about how can we maintain or how can we attain gender and racial balance on these kinds of leadership panels. And then, as I said at the beginning, I think changing our concept of editorial practice in scholarly publishing is really important, thinking about mentorship as opposed to gatekeeping. And that has a lot to do with power. You know, there's a lot of power in gatekeeping, not so much in mentorship. And I think if we could change that conception, then we might actually open the practice of editorship to other kinds of people as well. So I'll stop there. I know it was like a fire hose, but I can say more in the Q&A if there's time.
Please do say more. Always interested in what you have to say about this, Jean.
So I want to quote from Hope Obuke's Twitter thread calling out the National Book Critics Circle for its anti-Black racism during the ongoing protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. I do this because I think it's important, and Zach has really posed a very pointed and necessary question about how book history, even as a term, feels exclusionary. And I think it's important, and we have a kind of sub-thread in the chat function going on about different ways of thinking about the field and what other terms might be a better way of describing the actual diversity of what's going on here. But part of that actual diversity is seeing how what we do, what we're invested in, and the kind of change we want to see is actually playing out right now in the world in ways that call for our attention and response. As Wabuke shares, she was chairing a committee whose purpose was to put out a simple statement that says Black Lives Matter and racism is bad. However, the tactic over the past couple of weeks has been to, quote, deny, attack, delay, delay, deny, delay, delay, and now threatened. What she means by that is that someone on the board of the circle wrote her a very hostile email that begins with this: equating American book publishing with American police departments is ridiculous. Many of the writers cited in the letter's own lists would never have been published, if not for ecumenical, good-willed white editors and publishers who fought for the publication of Black writers. The email goes on, in my 40 years in literary and publishing life, I've seen far more of white people helping Black writers than Black people helping white writers. In her letter of resignation, Wabuke wrote this powerful rebuttal of the board member and the leadership, getting to Jean's point, that approved his racist airing of his views. This is the person who is directly deciding what books win prizes, what books get reviewed, and who reviews books. This directly affects how much money authors can negotiate for their next book. This is why hashtag publishing so white matters, hashtag book reviewing so white. So in solidarity with Wabuke, allow me to say, get rid of the conceptual gatekeeping. Echoing Jane once again, who's almost redefining editorship as a form of hosting and curation. And there's a kind of Derridian accent to that I appreciate. Gatekeeping, let me just say, is precisely the structural feature that white supremacy uses to defend its ground, its conceptual and methodological territory under the ruses of process, rigor, and mastery, qualities that Wabuke's antagonist has in mind when he says, quote, our list should include the best books, period, regardless of author ethnicity. These things are built into the structure, and it behooves us to have the conversation, kind of almost the thing that's going on in chat, about how not only how Sharp can diversify, but how we can rethink the organization from the ground up and rethink what we even mean by book history, which, as I put in the chat, I prefer to think of as a self-reflexive inquiry into the matter of knowledge. Thanks.
I'm just going to jump in now because to what Kenoi said, it also reminds me of Dignidad Literaria, which was a movement that started recently also in the States when with this novel about the Mexican family crossing the border, which was ridiculous and stereotyping. And also to touch upon some points that Kenoi was saying. So some of the obstacles that are commonplace excuses are like, what's the quality that minorities and marginalized peoples are bringing, right? So this gets questions all the time. And given the defensiveness of the establishment when this subject is discussed, we cannot expect that it will be solved by itself. So we all need to contest these assumptions within ourselves and as a discipline. And this requires also speaking up for also those that have the power, because of course there might be situations in where there's a PhD student and maybe they don't have the room to say this. So if you have the room, please say it. Thankfully, I have great supervisors, so I can speak my mind. So that's not a problem that I have. But for other PhD students or people that don't have tenure, this might be problematic. But if you have the power, please speak up. And also some pragmatic steps that could be taken is the inclusion of academic traditions from more regions and languages. And I specifically do not want to say other regions and languages because this othering makes English, French, and German as the norm. And it makes it sound like, oh, now your language and your region is allowed in, but you're not really part of it. So including more, that would be one step. And another step is to create truly interdisciplinary teams. So if we're researching practices from marginalized communities, this involves inviting members of said communities as equals in our research teams. After all, they are the experts. And a finally point, which we haven't really touched upon, is to support young researchers, but not by giving them a prize when they have finished their thesis or their book. Because for some communities, this is actually just perpetuating the lack of representativity. Because it takes a lot for you to finish that work, that thesis in a specific university. So maybe we should think of ways in how we can support upcoming researchers that are struggling to studies so that they can finish that great book. So thank you.
Sí quisiera decir algunos de los obstáculos reales que yo observo al menos, y que también son compartidos por numerosos colegas de América Latina, que hemos observado a través del tiempo y que dificultan establecer relaciones más equitativas, concretamente con las academias hegemónicas. En orden, podría decir que el primero es un desconocimiento bastante generalizado de qué es lo que se está haciendo en estudios de historia del libro en América Latina. En los casos en que sí se conoce qué es lo que se está haciendo, hay prácticas a veces conscientes y a veces no conscientes de invisibilización de esas investigaciones. Los textos no se citan o no se incorporan de forma explícita en otras investigaciones afines o en la docencia. Un segundo punto sería la dificultad para imaginar las limitaciones concretas en las que se hace historia del libro en América Latina. Por concretas me refiero a los problemas de sistematización de las fuentes documentales, las restricciones o las complejidades burocráticas para el acceso a acervos y bibliotecas, y las limitaciones para consultar bibliografía especializada, bibliografía al día. Cuando un peer review te manda a que revises 10 libros que no están en la biblioteca de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, tienes un problema para publicar en una revista. Otro, ok, no se oye.
Just to add this, because it was not on the text, when you get back from a reviewer, oh, check all these other 10 texts for your article, and those 10 texts are not present or are not available in your library, or they don't have access, so then how can you go through this?
Okay. Un tercer punto, obstáculos concretos, son las políticas lingüísticas y financieras restrictivas en algunas organizaciones de nuestra área, que suponen una barrera para numerosos académicos de América Latina, especialmente los más jóvenes, para que estos académicos puedan incorporarse de manera efectiva al coro, a la arena, al discurso internacional. Un ejemplo concreto de esto son las políticas de que solo los libros publicados en inglés pueden participar en The Long Book History Prize. Y por último, podría decir que otro obstáculo es la insuficiente diversidad en los comités editoriales de algunas revistas académicas, especialmente las anglosajonas, y que podemos ver que no cuentan con ni participación o de hablantes nativos de castellano o de miembros de América Latina, lo cual limita bastante a que puedan ser publicados textos o haya una sensibilidad para textos de esas materias. Para procurar una historia del libro más inclusiva y descentralizada, debemos revisar de forma crítica los modos en que nos organizamos como investigadores, como docentes y para la difusión de nuestro conocimiento. Un proyecto concreto para romper la fragmentación y el aislamiento académico y cuestionar el discurso dominante de la historia del libro centrado en el Estado-Nación fue formar la Red Latinoamericana de Cultura Gráfica en 2017. Esta red, que coordino en colaboración con Ana Uch de Brasil, agrupa hoy a más de 300 académicos de 10 países y tiene como fin pensar y trabajar de forma transnacional y multilingüe, lo que no se había aplicado de esta forma concreta en los estudios del libro en América Latina. Esperamos que la decidida participación de los miembros, así como las alianzas estratégicas con otras organizaciones, permitan modificar los obstáculos que dije anteriormente. Gracias.
Can I just jump in for 1 second, please, and talk a little bit about prizes?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Marina and Derrick, we haven't heard from you in this, so it would be great to hear.
Derrick, you're a prize winner. Why don't you jump in first, Derrick? Your book won a wonderful award recently. Can you say something and I'll jump in after you?
Yeah, sure, I will. I think I was just thinking about the question of prizes versus pathways. Because as a graduate student, I won prizes, but I also took a lot longer than the rest of my cohort to finish, because part of what my dissertation entailed was trying to figure out a pathway to do what I needed to do. So digesting the methodologies at hand that didn't fit the work I was trying to do, and then devise new ways of reading and seeing. So I think a both and approach could work. I think we need to be very aware of how long doing this kind of work takes, not just getting to the archives, getting to the stuff, but the kind of intellectual energy, labor, emotional labor it takes to do like decolonial work. I won the Bibliographical Society Prize, and sort of how I got there, I was invited to submit my book by the director because we met at Black Bibliography Conference at yet first at Delaware, then at Yale. And so networks, I probably wouldn't have submitted because I wasn't thinking along those lines. I wasn't thinking that my book did that kind of work in that way, both because I had a sort of narrow vision of what bibliography did. And I need to rethink that because I think my work has something to say to that. And also on their end, they're actively sort of reaching out to create pathways. So that's I think a situation where both and is happening, and we'll see, we're working. I'll put it that way. I'm also hyper aware, again, a kind of invisible man sense of becoming the one that gets asked to do all the work. And I think in various ways, people on the screen have experienced this, where organizations know one or two, and you end up bandying about things between you because they've asked one of you, and you're already overworked. So they ask you, you're already overworked, and the other people you suggest don't seem to fit for them because they haven't won the prize, broadly conceived. And so this gets back to the question of pathways, right? And power and the seals of approval that power brokers decide matter to them, and which seals of approval don't matter to them so much. And the other thing, sort of bending this towards another sort of practical thing, I've been thinking about citation a lot, in part because one of my colleagues here, Tao Goff, is developing a seminar on citation, but also because of initiatives like #CiteBlackWomen. Right, there are foundational works to book history, to print culture, that have traditionally not been cited. And one of the things I actively do in my pedagogy is say, if you're constructing a bibliography or a study, if I'm reviewing an article and all I see are white men or all I see are men, something is fundamentally flawed with what's going on here. And in some ways, it can be just not knowing. If you don't know, you don't know. But in other ways, it's a lack of effort. It's a lack of awareness. It's a lack of ethics, which has become key to me because, again, sort of my last thought on this is that at least my specific field, there are plethora of white scholars doing work on Black archives, Latin America archives, et cetera. And in the current market situation, it's a boom field. And so what I see that has been just sort of disturbing has been people who are glomming onto the terms, decolonizing, African-American print culture, et cetera. And they get the job, and then that work sort of moves away, right? And so it's a kind of glomming onto the terms, the methods, as a way to gain a kind of cultural currency, a signaling, but it's not actually attending to the ethics and the needs of the communities that one is sort of doing the work on and for. So I suppose that gets down to the question, okay, you've thought about this, you've done the dissertation, your article won the prize. What's the next thing gonna be? Are you just gonna shift over to this completely mainstream colonial project and keep it moving now that you've gotten the job? I'll stop there.
Please don't, Derrick. That was I couldn't agree more with all of that. Priya, you were keen to talk about prizes and more.
Do we have time? Because we're at 12:15. I'm happy to.
Yeah, I mean,
Derrick
I think we have time. I think we've got time for a comment from you. Maybe since the conversation is so lively in the chat, time for a few questions as well, if people are willing to stay.
Okay, thank you. Derrick, what you said was amazing about pathways, not prizes, because I mentioned in the chat feature a book by James English called The Economy of Prestige, and English does this sociology of prizes. And one of the great findings in that book, among many, is that actually prizes make no difference, right? They make a difference to the author, they make a difference to a certain enterprise, but if by difference we mean who reads these books that win prizes, and English has films and fiction and poetry and so on, it's a very broad archival field that he looks at. In fact, the prize-winning novels are not the novels that have the widest readership. The prize-winning academic books may not always have the biggest kind of purchase. So for that, I would simply say two things. One, we need to be patient, right? Yeah, my prize doubled my salary, but big deal. I mean, it did nothing to the field. I'd like to believe that it will take some time. So I think academia is a very slow moving machine. The second thing I want to say is I'm serving on a prize committee for the second year, and it is so hard to budge I chaired the committee, so I got to set the parameters. It is so hard to budge my judges, who are all great people. They're all lovely liberals. But to say, I'm sorry, your finalist list needs to give me people of color and women. And if you don't, you have to question your biases. This was said at the outset. It's really hard. And this year, I'm not judging that committee, and I'm curious to see what will transpire. I'm going to draw this chat to their attention. But prizes and prize committees and the biases are a problem. And Jim English does a great job raising that in his book. But for all of you, recognize that the work you're doing is super, super valuable. And when you don't win a prize, and if you don't win a prize, that's just a metric, but it's not the metric.
Yeah, can I jump in here?
Please
So I just served on my first prize committee. Can people hear me?
Yes.
And I think you're so right. The committee and the organization issuing the prize has to make it a part of its criteria. Like, this is the mission of this prize, is to reward the best work in this field. And part of constituting that field and getting to the best work means dismantling the kind of, for lack of a better word, colorblind sort of notion that the best work will come to us in some mysterious way, and we'll be able to see it and judge it in some sort of non-biased way. And that also means the uncomfortable thing of saying, if this work is just engaged in doing the same old work, citing the same old people, even if it's a beautifully written article and it does interesting stuff, it's not the best work. It is, I will be maybe a little Dr. McNair about this, though I guess I reserve the right to contradict myself. It is impossible to do the best work if you're just citing the same old white folk. It is impossible. It is a contradiction in terms. Maybe it's reading James Cone, because James Cone says white Christianity is a contradiction in terms because whiteness is a contradiction of what Christianity is supposed to be about, in his interpretation of what Christianity is supposed to be about. I glom that on to my idea of what like scholarship is supposed to do.
Am I?
Yeah, now you are.
Am I muted? No. Okay, participants, do you have any final comments before we open up to the lovely audience?
Sí quisiera decir que esta situación sanitaria internacional que nos ha tocado vivir, la pandemia, de alguna manera forzó o hizo posible que hoy estuviéramos aquí reunidos hablando de esto, porque de otra forma, al menos yo no hubiera podido ir a Ámsterdam. Entonces, quisiera pensar que un costado bueno de esta situación es que estas puertas, que no son solo simbólicas, son materiales, que se han abierto, continúen abiertas. Creo que tenemos que pensar en consolidar estos espacios, no solo los de las mesas redondas, sino también que no implican necesariamente un traslado, un movimiento, que no implican costos para poder ir. La gratuidad del evento es una cosa que para muchos es una barrera muy concreta, y en ese sentido celebro la reunión y espero que siga habiendo más en este marco. Si pueden ser presenciales, fantástico, para abrazarnos, pero si no, que no se interrumpan.
And a silver lining from this pandemic and the health situation that we find ourselves in is that thanks to that, now we could be in this panel. And Marina says that it was going to happen in Amsterdam, but she couldn't have attended. And this is another point. There are material costs to going to certain events. And so it's important to have events that are accessible and free, and also to have these spaces where people don't need to move from one place to another, but they still can participate. And of course, having live events where we can see each other and give hugs to each other, that's great. But it's also important to open these spaces because it's not always possible for everybody to move around the world. And also it's not so eco-conscious. She didn't say that, but I added that.
No, I believe that.
Okay, it's also from her.
Okay, do any audience members want to ask? I think we've got time for maybe a couple of questions if anyone wants to ask anything that hasn't been answered in the chat. So if anyone wants to speak, just type in your question now. I think this is more of a... Okay, I don't think anyone does have any other questions, so I think it's probably best to end it there. It's been an absolutely fantastic discussion today. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think the biggest takeaway is burn it all down. I want to say a huge thank you to our fantastic participants, Priya, Marina, Jean, Kenoi, and Andrea and Derrick, for just being absolutely magnificent and for speaking the truth and for opening this conversation out to something I hope we're going to have on a yearly basis and something that I hope we don't need to have in the future. And also to my wonderful co-organizer Danielle, and to Sharp for suggesting that we kick off what is going to be a fantastic week of virtual events. So this is the point in the day that we normally continue our discussions over a cup of coffee with old friends and new, and it's very sad that we can't do this in person. But we do want to continue this conversation. So if you are interested in the themes that we've talked about today, or if you have any feedback, ideas, etc., please do contact us on the Sharp and Focus email addresses. And I'm sure the participants would love to hear from you as well. So thank you all for coming today, and thank you very much for this conversation.